The fieldwork started in '68. I had done some preliminary preparations in South Africa, especially in the University of Cape Town, which was my sort of home base university, as far as the university is concerned, because that was Peter Karsten's alma mater, and he said, "Why don't you use that as your kind of university base in Africa?" And I also then went to Witwatersrand University in Johannesburg with a view to meet some people who had been to Khansi, where I was headed. And then eventually, after 2 months, I arrived in Khansi at the Dekar site, the village of Dekar, in June 1968. Well, I had a fairly small grant. I was funded by Shirk. Well, I think, was it called Shirk then? And I also had an Ontario scholarship. And my supervisor said I shouldn't get a vehicle. I should work on foot, just be in a village and stay there and use that as my base of operation. Well, I didn't find that worked very well, because first of all, the Bushmen, of course, are nomadic people, and even though they were living at the farm, there was a lot of coming and going of people. And I needed to go with people to different farm villages and even beyond the village, where a lot of people had family, Bushmen, had kin, and including beyond the farms where there were still hunter-gatherers that followed the old way of life. So I needed a vehicle. So I thought I'd try it with a donkey. So I got a donkey and rode through the landscape, but that doesn't take you very far. Anyway, so after about 2 months at Dekar, I decided, no, that's no good. I need to get a vehicle. So I hitchhiked back on the back of a cattle truck. It's 400 miles from Gubabis, which is the border town, not Gubabis, Lobatse, the border town between South Africa, Transvaal, and Botswana. And that's where, back then, there was only one road to Khansi, and it was right through the Kalahari. And by road, I mean a track through the sand, loose sand, and the only way to get there was by cattle truck. So when I first went, I was on the back of a cattle truck. And the journey took 36 hours. And then, well, then 2 months later, to get my own vehicle, I was back on the cattle truck again, to go back to Johannesburg, where I bought an old second-hand Nissan truck, which was the bane of my existence, because it had a narrower spoor than the American trucks the Boers drove through the sand there. So whenever I drove this vehicle, it jumped the spoor, because it didn't fit into the spoor, and it broke down all the time. But anyway, I had a vehicle. The other thing I did when I was in Johannesburg was a rather unusual thing, but it was a life-changing thing in many, many ways. I phoned the mission station where I was located. Well, they wanted to set up a clinic because there was no medical services around anywhere. We're talking a really isolated part of the Kalahari, the Western Kalahari. It's very much like Canada, 99% of Canadian population is in the south. In the far north, very few. Same there. I mean, in Botswana, most people live in the eastern part of the country. The west is sort of the Siberia of Botswana. And anyway, so I was in a very isolated region, and they had no medical services. And so the two missionaries wanted to set up a clinic. Well, my girlfriend and almost fiancée at the time, is a nurse, was a nurse, Patricia. And she actually had wanted to come along on this venture. She was always a great fan of Albert Schweitzer, the Lamborghini thing. She was very keen to set up a bush clinic. So when I was in Johannesburg to get my vehicle, I put a placed a long distance call to Toronto and asked her, why don't you come? Would you like? Oh yes, she came. She was so she arrived 2 months later, and except that there were certain strings attached as far as the mission station is concerned. They wanted us to be ideally married, So, well, we got married. The district commissioner of Hansi married us, a young guy. He was a year older than I, British guy from the colonial service, and he married us. By the way, 2 years later, Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor were married in Maun. So it was not, I guess we set a precedent, although their marriage didn't last. Ours is still together. Anyway, I'm babbling here. But it was really a very interesting, a very good thing. So that was a very eventful trip. It got me a vehicle, and it got me a wife. And it got me, it made fieldwork so much more enjoyable and valuable in many ways, personally, of course, but also Patricia ran the clinic. A clinic, she treated about 18,000 people while we were there. And she kept careful records on each patient. And I have these records. I still haven't done something with them, but I'm thinking of doing something with them. So that would mean venturing into medical anthropology at a new vista. Anyway, but it was also a service that people really, really appreciated. It's one thing to be an anthropologist with your clipboard and your tape recorder, bothering people, you soon overstay your welcome. But if your partner is a nurse who's there 24/7, on call all the time, and her services were free, and badly needed. There were so many unbelievable experiences that I had where she saved lives, and also my trucks often served as a hearse. Couple of times as a hearse, many times as an ambulance, because we sometimes had to take really seriously bad patients to the nearest hospital in Maun, which was about 300 kilometers to the east, and a car journey of about 11 to 12 hours. And every so often we'd take really serious patients to Maun. So fieldwork to me was combined with a honeymoon, and we lived in the village. It was very much participant observation type of fieldwork. In fact, Shuji Nagata, my supervisor, did that ritual that so many fieldwork ethnographers go through when they set out in the field. A copy of Notes and Queries in Anthropology, which he gave to me, the latest edition of this work that was started, in the 19th century? And then I think the last edition was in 1956, I think, and I got that edition. So my fieldwork was participant observation. We lived in the village itself, in a kaudang hut, and I did daily visits of the village and interviews and household surveys and collected life histories and the usual stuff, and all fascinating stuff, genealogies, and even and stories. I was very interested in. This is all part of my interest in the religion. I collected myth and stories, which I later published in a book. The it was a sort of grab-all approach. I tried to, including collecting artifacts and bringing that back, that collection, a big trunk full, which the Royal Ontario Museum acquired when I returned. And I also attended trance dances, which, of course, the trance curing dance is the major Bushman ritual, which was practiced to the consternation of the missionary who tried to eradicate this sort of stuff. But they were practiced extensively at the village and neighboring villages. So I attended trance dances, and I also attended the Sunday church services run by the mission church to get so I participated as best I could in the lives of the people to try to gain an understanding of their life experience, their life situation. There were difficulties for sure. The one big difficulty was the language, of course. The Nharo, this is the group I studied, their language had not as yet been studied. At the moment, there is it is being studied. A phonology has been developed, and by a Summer Institute of Linguistics person. He's there with his wife to do a linguistic study of Nharo, as well as translate the Bible into Nharo, which is partially done now, 20 years later. He's been there now for about 20 years. But at the time, the language hadn't been studied, so I had to acquire, as best I could, fluency in the language. And I never managed this quite well. I had a sort of uncertain fluency. It's sufficient for everyday simple conversations, but when we went into discussions of Bushman theology, myth, cosmology, belief, I worked with two interpreters and my own language. But the other problem about the language, apart from the intrinsic difficulty of learning a click language, which is a challenge, because we don't click. Well, we do a few clicks. Like, for example, when we chide a child, that's the lateral click, yeah? Or ride a horse, that's, when child we go, that's a dental click. Anyway, but the other problem is, this is a multi-ethnic society, a pluralistic society. There were in Khansi, as small and isolated and remote as the region as it was, there were, first of all, three groups of Bushmen: the Nharo, the Kalkaisi, which are Krum speakers, and the Gui people, and the Kron. The Kron is Southern Bushman, a totally different language. So I couldn't possibly acquire all three. So I focused on Nharo, the majority group of Bushman group in the region. But in addition, there were, of course, the Boers who had set up the farming, the ranching, the ranches in the region in the 1890s. Also English and German farmers were there, with whom I had to interact, because this was part of, when you do something like sociocultural change of a group who live in a plural society, you need to interact with all these other groups, right? And then there were Bantu-speaking people, the Tswana, the Herero, the Kalahari, there were a few Ovambo, and there were even some Nama people there. So it was a multi-ethnic, polyglot society, and I needed to interact with all these people. So as a result, I experienced problems with communication, with language. But by far the most difficult problem in my fieldwork was this: there was a lot of conflict. It was Botswana had recently obtained her independence as a country in 1966. I was there in 1968. And liberal democracy tried to replace what had been a colonial society, especially in the Khansi area where I was, an enclave in the society that had been set up by Boers who subscribed to apartheid, to a very, very firm white, we'd call it, white supremacist sort of ideology. So there was this clash between the liberal, the black, the new liberalism of democratic, multi-ethnic society that the modern Botswana, and then this colonial apartheid dominated community where I was situated, and this created tension between, especially the blacks, who really felt very antagonistic to the established Boer settlers there, and there was even tension in the village I was at, a village of only about 100 people, was a kind of microcosm of this larger conflict-ridden society. And there was tension even between the two missionaries, one black, one white. There was a mission church run by the black evangelist to which the Bushmen went. And then there was the church, a little chapel in the Boer farmer's house with a little organ where they held, the whites held their church services. So there was still entrenched segregation, in this community, in a society that newly gained independence, had committed itself to do away with this. And so I was in a along with that, the Bushmen suffered a lot of existential stress. There was a lot of disease, tuberculosis in particular, malnutrition. The life expectancy amongst the farm Bushmen was in their mid-30s, as opposed to in the mid-70s, as Richard Lee reported amongst the Dobe, the traditional Bushmen. And there was the so-called Baskap. Baskap is an Afrikaans word where the white farmer imposed a kind of harsh paternalism over non-whites, especially his Bushman workers. And sometimes it included physically beating a Bushman. So there was a lot of tension there. There was a lot of underemployment, a lot of poverty. So there was constant conflict, and that really got to Patricia and me. It was very demoralizing. But the other thing that happened is that we were drawn into these conflicts ourselves, into these coalitions and these alliances and intrigues, factions, as go-betweens, or as advocates or as arbiters. All that was difficult. So it was a very the fieldwork experience had a dark side to it for me. It was because of these unresolved conflicts. In fact, the theme of conflict is in the first book I did. Just a small book. It is an offshoot from from my PhD. It's a section of the PhD is it has conflict in it. It deals with how conflict affects a pluralistic society, how it is a formative force in the development of stratification when a pluralistic society transforms itself into a stratified society. So this first book called The Farm Bushmen of the Country District, Botswana, deals with the process of incorporation, assimilation of these recently hunter-gatherer people who are now an ethnic minority discriminated against within a conflict-ridden pluralistic society that is on the verge of becoming a stratified society. And this book deals with that. So it isn't really, as opposed to my second book, The Nharo Bushmen of Botswana, Tradition and Change, which is more a sort of classic acculturation study that deals with sociocultural changes of a particular Bushman group. This is much more sociological, the first one. This is more anthropological. And conflict is, in fact, integral to this book. It's a sociological study of conflict in a African post-colonial setting that focuses on one of these plural groups as it tries to accommodate itself into all of this and is surrounded and overwhelmed by it. Now, I'm not saying, I mean, fieldwork was also very rewarding, I must say. I formed many, many friendships that have lasted to this day, although a lot of the people now have died, of course. I have learned so much. A trove of information I gathered from these generous people that I still process to this day. I still work up some, my present book, which I'll talk later, it still draws on data that I collected back then. And of course, I also went back. I went back about a dozen times between then, 68 to 70. I went back about another 10 or 11 times to do follow-up studies. So I have a kind of longitudinal handle on this one community, which in the meantime has mushroomed from 100 people to over 1,000 now. Yeah. And Patricia, who set up that clinic, the clinic is still around. It's now run by the government. It's the principal medical station for the region, which she founded, which is very gratifying for Patricia more than for me.